The first time I saw her, she was standing on the riverbank with a wool blanket wrapped to her chin like a small queen hiding from the wind. Bare feet sunk in black mud, eyes lifted to the big house as if it was the moon, and she was waiting for it to answer. She was too young to know that looking long at that place could get you killed, and already old enough to look like someone who had been waiting her whole life. Low-country dusk was falling hard that evening, the kind that makes the cypress silhouettes look like men with the knives for elbows. The air smelled of pluff mud and sweet rot. Mosquitoes sang in the reeds. And behind her, in the water, something slid under the surface, slow. Not a gator, not a fish, something that made the skin on my arms go tight even before I understood why. I did not know her name then. I did not know that by the time the church was done with her, she would wear a name that was never hers, sit in a chair meant for a dead woman, and smile the way a person smiles when the teeth are not really their own. I only knew that the plantation had gone quiet in a way that was not peace, and that a child standing alone at the river when the bell had already rung for supper was a bad sign in any season, but especially in that one. So, before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if this is your first time here at Tales Never Told. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story only gets darker from here. My name is Reverend Thomas Ewell. Back then, I was not much of a reverend, just a young curate attached to St. Dymphna Church on the edge of Colleton County, sent down from Charleston with a stack of sermons and a head full of rules about grace and order, and not a single warning about what grace and order look like when a wealthy family decides to twist them into a rope. St. Dymphna was old even then, whitewashed clapboard, steeple that leaned a finger toward heaven like accusation, graveyard of oyster shell and live oak. On Sundays, the pews filled with the planters in front and the slaves behind, the divide marked by nothing but habit and the way a man's eyes moved when he chose to see another man as a chair instead of a soul. I had been there less than a year when the Langford family came to me with their trouble. Hawthorne Langford owned Riverlark Plantation, a broad spread of tidal rice and cotton, a big house lifted on brick piers, and a workforce of enslaved people who knew the tides better than any white man did. Hawthorne was a stern man in late middle age, tall and narrow like a cypress trunk, with a voice that could turn sweet or sharp depending on what he wanted. His wife Eleanor was younger, pale, soft-spoken, and sick in a way that never showed in public until it was too late. Folks called her delicate, doctors called her frail, the slaves called her mist lady, and even they said it with careful tenderness because she did not strike them, did not curse them, did not throw crockery when she was displeased. She walked the galleries in evening light and read poetry aloud as if the river might learn it and carry it to the sea. When I first met her, she smiled like a person who had been practicing for a portrait. There was warmth there, but also distance, a thin glass between her and the world. The Langfords had no children. This was the first crack in their wall, and everyone in county society knew it, even if nobody said it out loud. In that country, a family without heirs is a house without a roof. Every storm gets in. People start taking inventory. Men start making offers. Other widows start practicing sympathetic looks. Hawthorne hated that gaze. It made him stiffen at charity suppers and ride too hard after foxes. It made him spend long hours in his study with ledgers open like wounds. Eleanor had suffered losses early in their marriage, and after the last one nearly killed her. No more pregnancies came. She drifted through the house like a lamp turned low. The slaves found her sitting by the back garden at dawn sometimes, hands on her stomach as if she was holding something she had lost in another life. I knew these things because the church hears what the fields whisper in confession, in gossip after service, in the way a woman stands too close to a window while a sermon is still going. In the last years before the war, Eleanor began coughing blood. Not loud, not dramatic, just a handkerchief folded quick into her palm, and a smile that said, "Please pretend you did not see." Hawthorne, brought doctors from the city. They bled her. They dosed her with laudanum. They talked about consumption in that soft, fatal way doctors use when they want a rich man to pay, without demanding a miracle. Nothing helped. Her skin went almost translucent. The veins in her wrists looked like ink in water. She still came to church at first, still sat in the front pew with her back tall and her hat shadowing the hollows under her eyes. You could feel the congregation watching her with a kind of hungry pity. Sick women on plantations are like cracked teacups. Everyone worries about the mess they will leave behind. One Sunday after service, she asked me to walk with her through the graveyard. She moved slow under the live oaks, dropping Spanish moss like old hair. She said, "Reverend, you believe the Lord hears every prayer." I said, "Yes, because that is your job when you are young." She nodded and said, "Then he has heard mine," and decided not to answer. She looked at the slate stones and said, "I am afraid of leaving this house to him alone." I knew she meant Hawthorne, but I also knew she meant the planters around him who would circle like crows once she was gone. The old family name that would die without an heir. The field hands who would be sold to settle debts if the plantation fell. The church itself, which depended on his gifts. She said, "Sometimes I think I am a ghost already, and the house is just waiting for my body to catch up. There are things a curate does not say to a married woman without making his own collar feel tight. So I said the least dangerous truth. I said, 'The Lord does not waste your pain.'" She smiled faint and said, "I hope you are right." Soon after, she stopped coming to church. By summer, she was confined to her bed. Hawthorne came to me one evening carrying his hat in both hands like a beggar holding a bowl. He was not a man who begged. He said, "Reverend Ewell, I need you at Riverlark tomorrow. My wife has asked for the sacrament." I went. The big house smelled of camphor and wilting magnolia. Slave women moved quiet through the halls. In the upstairs bedchamber, Eleanor lay propped on pillows, hair spread like pale seaweed, mouth dry and cracked. Her sister, Priscilla Harrow, sat by the window sewing, as if she could stitch time back together. Eleanor took the wafer with trembling fingers. She swallowed and looked at me hard. She said, "There is something I need to tell you, but not here." Hawthorne leaned closer, thinking she meant some last instruction about property or debts. She shook her head. She said, "Later, when I am not watched." Hawthorne frowned, kissed her forehead, and left the room. Once he was gone, she reached under the blanket and pulled out a small tin locket. She pressed it into my hand. It was warm from her skin. I opened it and saw a curl of black hair inside. I assumed a relic of grief, some childish keepsake. She said, "Do not show that to him." I said, "Whose hair is this?" She turned her face toward the wall. She said, "It is the only child I will ever have." I did not understand. I said, "Eleanor, you are in pain." She whispered, "I am not confused. There is a girl. She is down in the quarters." I heard Hawthorne footsteps change in the hall outside. I snapped the locket shut. Eleanor said, "I found her after a storm on the river marsh. Her mother is one of my husband's women. Mixed blood. The girl looked like me when I was a child." Hawthorne does not know I have been watching her. She is bright. She is kind. She has my eyes. I felt a coldness crawl up my throat. I said, "What are you asking me?" She said, "Nothing yet. Just remember that I told you, so I am not taken for mad after I am gone." She closed her eyes and tears leaked sideways into the pillow. She said, "If you have a heart that still knows right from wrong, do not let the church be used against her." Then she fell asleep. Hawthorne entered the room with a tight smile and asked if everything was peaceful. I lied. I said yes. I left the house carrying that locket, like I had stolen something. That night I tried to pray and found my mouth full of sand. I told myself Eleanor's sickness had made her thoughts strange, that women on plantations sometimes fixate on the children in the quarters like dolls that can be loved without consequence. I told myself that was all. I was wrong. Eleanor died before dawn some weeks later. The house bell rang out across the fields. I rode to Riverlark by noon. Black cloth already draped the porch rails. The women of the house were in mourning. The slaves were lined behind the kitchen door, heads bowed, some crying for real, some crying because it is safer to cry. Hawthorne stood by the parlor window with his back to the room, staring at the river like it was a road he might walk if his boots could find it. Priscilla was already managing the house. She was a hard woman with sharp cheekbones and a way of speaking that never wasted mercy. I gave the funeral service in the family cemetery under live oak shade, the air thick with summer gnats, the smell of turned earth, sweet and sour at once. Hawthorne did not cry. He gripped the soil loose in his fist until his knuckles went bone white. When I said, "Ashes to ashes," he mouthed the words with me like a vow. After the burial, he asked me to come inside. We sat in his study. The curtains were drawn. The desk was neat in that rigid way. Neatness becomes when grief tries to control chaos. He poured whiskey into 2 glasses and pushed one toward me. "I did not drink," he said. "Reverend, my wife left behind a request." He slid a folded paper toward me. The handwriting was Eleanor, looping, steady, already a ghost. I opened it and read that there was a child named Mercy in the quarters, that she was to be brought into the house and raised under Priscilla guidance, baptized at St. Dymphna, recorded as a ward of the Langford family, with no mention of her birth or station. I looked up. Hawthorne nodded without meeting my eyes. He said, "She told me the girl is mine by blood." He said it flat like he was reading a line in a ledger. I asked who the mother was, and he said it did not matter now. He said people are already whispering about his lack of heirs, that if the girl is known as a slave child, she will be sold, or worse, by those who hate him. But if she is known as kin, the county will keep its mouths polite, because money and fear do that to people. He said the church must do its part. Baptize her. Record her clean. No quarters, no skin, no questions. I told him he was asking me to falsify a record. He said he was asking me to honor his wife's last will. He said the child would be what we said she was. Priscilla entered then without knocking. Cold as a blade, she said we must move quickly, that the house needed a woman, that the child must be trained not as charity, but as replacement, as heir, as the future mistress of Riverlark. Hawthorne did not correct her. I felt a sickness in my chest, and still, I said yes, because I was young, because I was scared, because refusing evil is easier before it settles in like furniture. That afternoon, Priscilla went to the quarters with 2 housewomen and a silver bell. I followed at a distance, already trying to pretend I was not part of this. In the doorway of a cabin, I saw Hannah, a field hand with shoulders wide from rice work, holding a very small girl on her hip. The girl wore a dress too big for her, tied at the waist with twine. Her skin was the color of warm coffee with cream, not dark, not light enough to pass unless lamps were low and people were willing to lie. Her hair was thick and black, braided by hands that knew how to work. Her eyes were blue. Blue eyes in a slave child is like a bell ringing in a graveyard. Priscilla looked at her the way a buyer looks at a mule. Hannah tightened her arms. Priscilla said, "Is that Mercy?" Hannah said, "Yes, Mom." Priscilla said, "She is coming with me." Hannah said, "Mom, she too young. She my baby." Priscilla said, "Mercy does not belong to you. She never did." She rang the bell once, and 2 white overseer types stepped out from behind the cabins. They took the child from Hannah. Mercy clung and screamed until Priscilla said, "Hush, your ma is dead." It was a lie spoken like law. Mercy froze. Hannah fell to her knees in the sand, sobbing without moving because moving would buy her a whip. Mercy stopped screaming, not because she accepted it, but because she learned in that moment that sound can be taken from you. They carried her toward the big house, while the quarters went silent behind us except for Hannah, crying and a low hum rising from the other women like a funeral hymn, under breath. The next Sunday, I baptized the child in private. Priscilla, named her Mercy Eleanor Langford. I wrote the name in the church register. I did not write her mother's name, her birthplace, or her condition. Then I dipped my fingers in the font and watched water slide down her forehead while she stared through me, like she was already somewhere else. I told myself I was protecting her. I did not yet understand that sometimes protection is just a prettier word for possession, and that once a church signs a lie into ink, the lie starts walking around like it owns the place. After that day, the big house swallowed Mercy the way a swamp swallows a dropped lantern, slow at first, then all at once, until the light is gone and only the ripples remain. Priscilla moved her into the nursery that had never held a living child long enough to leave tooth marks on its crib rails. The room still smelled faintly of lavender and stale milk from the last infant Eleanor had lost. And when Mercy stepped inside, she kept turning her head as if listening for a cry that lived in the walls. They cut her hair to neaten it, pulling the braids out with a comb that snagged and tore, then washing her with lye soap until her mouth trembled and her scalp was tender. The housewomen fussed over her in that careful way people do when they are trying to convince themselves they are kind. They dressed her in one of Eleanor's old childhood gowns Priscilla had kept in cedar, pale cotton with tiny blue flowers that made Mercy look like a doll someone had half-painted. She did not cry after the first night. That was the thing that struck me most when I visited to bring prayers to Hawthorne. Mercy watched. Mercy listened. Mercy learned that the safest thing in a place that does not belong to you is silence. Hawthorne withdrew into himself the way widowers do when their grief is mixed with guilt. He had her brought to his study sometimes and would stare at her with a stricken curiosity, like he was waiting for her face to explain what his wife had never said aloud. I saw him once, kneeling in front of her, while she sat stiff on a brocade chair, too high for her feet to touch the floor. He lifted her chin gently between his fingers and said, "You got her eyes." Mercy did not answer. Her eyes did not soften. She looked past him at the dark shelves of books that smelled like mold and tobacco. Hawthorne turned away quick, ashamed of the tenderness he had allowed himself, and called for Priscilla to take her back. Mercy returned to the nursery with a tiny straight spine, as if she had been carrying a heavy tray. The quarters did not forget her. Hannah, the woman they had torn her from, was made to keep working in the rice fields as if her womb had never held anything at all. There were nights I heard her wailing carry across the river like a wounded animal, then suddenly cut off when an overseer barked or a whip snapped. The other enslaved folk began to treat Mercy, name like a prayer you say, only in your head. I would see them in church eyes following her small figure when Priscilla marched her down the center aisle to sit in the front pew with the family. Mercy never looked back toward them. She stared forward at the altar, lips pressed tight, face smooth as a mask. Priscilla told me after service that Mercy must not mingle with their old ways. She said the girl was delicate and would be poisoned by the ignorance of the quarters. She asked me to speak to the slaves about respect for the new young lady. I told her the people already respected what they feared. She smiled without warmth as if I had made a joke. Priscilla was not raising a child. She was sculpting a replacement. Every morning, Mercy was woken before dawn, bathed, combed, dressed, and brought downstairs for lessons. A tutor from Beaufort came twice a week to teach her letters, sums, French vowels that rolled like pebbles in her mouth, and piano scales that bent her small fingers over ivory. When she made mistakes, Priscilla corrected her with a tap of a ruler on the knuckles, not hard enough to bruise, just enough to remind Mercy which world she belonged to now. When Mercy lacked a word, she was not allowed to say it in the rhythm of the quarters. No gullah cadence, no river slang. Priscilla made her repeat sentences until her voice flattened into the White House sound. Every afternoon she was taken through the house to memorize rooms, cabinets, linen inventories, the way Eleanor had arranged flowers on a parlor table, the pattern of her tea service, the order of prayers before meals. I once watched Priscilla hold up a portrait of Eleanor, the one painted soon after her marriage. She pointed at the eyes, the mouth, the posture. She said, "This is how you will sit. This is how you will speak. This is how you will smile when visitors enter." Mercy looked at the portrait a long time. Then she said, "Why?" It was the first full word I had ever heard her say. Priscilla's face twitched like she had been slapped. She said, "Because you owe her your life, you will honor her by becoming her." Mercy nodded once, slow, as if she was accepting a bargain she had no power to refuse. I told myself again that Mercy was being protected, fed, taught, spared the whip. Yet the longer I watched, the less I could shake the feeling that what they were doing was not salvation, but a kind of burial while still breathing. It is one thing to take a child out of misery. It is another to strip her of every thread that ties her to herself and call the nakedness mercy. The church became part of it, in ways I did not expect. St. Dymphna ladies took to Mercy like a curiosity. They brought her sweets, lace handkerchiefs, little wooden dolls that all had pale faces and blonde curls. They cooed over her manners. They told Priscilla what a blessing the Lord had sent after Eleanor passing. They did not ask about her mother. They did not ask why a child who had been listed nowhere in the county suddenly sat in the first pew with the Langfords. They did what church folk have always done when a powerful family gives them a story to repeat. They repeated it. I repeated it. Each Sunday I introduced her as Miss Mercy Langford, ward of the late Mrs. Langford, chosen by Providence to bring comfort to her widower and continue the Christian household. I watched the enslaved women in the back row go rigid when I said it. I watched Hannah stare at the floor so hard it looked like she wanted to burn through it and crawl back to her baby. The lie grew roots there among hymnals and rattling fans. Hawthorne began bringing Mercy with him to social calls. At first she held his hand like a stranger holds a railing, using it to steady herself without trusting it. But county society is a river you can keep your footing in only by letting it carry you. People began to say she had Eleanor spirit. They said it so often that Mercy learned to nod when she heard it, as if it was a compliment and not a chain. The war came. It had been creeping toward us for years like thunder on a horizon no one wants to name. When cannon finally thundered in distant places, Colleton County pretended it was not there, then slowly was forced to admit the truth by the way young men left wearing gray and came back wrapped in canvas, or not at all. Riverlark sent rice and cotton to the cause. Hawthorne served on committees. Priscilla organized sewing circles. Through it all, Mercy grew, and as she grew, her skin lightened in everyone's mind until they could look at her without seeing what they did not wish to see. When she reached an age where her body began to shift into womanhood, Priscilla tightened her control. Mercy was never left alone with a man except Hawthorne, never allowed to go near the quarters, never allowed to swim in the river, never allowed even wet earth under her nails. Priscilla said there were dangers for a young lady. She did not say which dangers she meant. I had a sense. A girl of mixed blood in a plantation world is a candle in a drafty room. Every gust wants to snuff it or use it to light something else. I watched Mercy during those years and saw a calm settle over her that did not come from peace. She performed. She became a student of other people's expectations. She learned which smile got approval, which tilt of the head got praise, which silence kept her safe. But some nights, when I passed Riverlark late on the way home from a sick call, I saw her in an upstairs window staring out toward the quarters with a look that did not belong to the young lady Priscilla was presenting to the world. It was a look like a door cracked open, just enough to let the cold in. I began to notice things in the church records that made me uneasy. Birth registers with gaps, death entries with no cause. Baptisms of infants I never saw in the pews again. All of it tied to Riverlark and to Priscilla's steady hand. When I asked the church clerk about an absence, he shrugged and said Priscilla handled much of the paperwork now, that I had enough to do with sermons and the war. I should have insisted on seeing every line myself. I did not. The war pressed hard on the coast. Union gunboats came prowling the rivers. Refugees from inland plantations filtered through, hungry and frightened. Some enslaved people ran toward Union lines. Others were taken by owners fleeing inland. Hawthorne refused to abandon Riverlark. He was stubborn as old stone. He said his wife was buried there, his father before her, that he would die on that soil rather than see Yankees trample it. Mercy was 15 or maybe 16 when the first Union raid came close enough for smoke to stain our sunset. Priscilla locked the house up tight and moved valuables into the attic. She kept Mercy inside for days, curtains shut, lighting candles even at noon so no one could see her profile from outside. Mercy paced like a caged thing. She asked Priscilla if they would free the slaves if the Yankees came. Priscilla slapped her. Not hard, but sharp enough to leave a red print. She said, "You never say that word again." Mercy touched her cheek and did not cry. She just looked at Priscilla with a quiet hatred that made my stomach flip when I heard about it later from a housewoman. That same week, a young Union officer wandered into St. Dymphna on a gray morning when the congregation was thin and restless. He had a bullet wound in his shoulder and was looking for a doctor. We patched him in the vestry. His name was Lieutenant Caleb Price, a school teacher from Ohio turned soldier, eyes tired but steady. While I bound him, he glanced at the front pew and nodded toward the Langford crest carved into it. He said, "That family got a ward, don't they?" I asked how he knew. He said he had seen her once from the road, a girl in morning black, standing on the gallery like a statue. He said, "She looked like someone wearing somebody else's face." I laughed nervously and asked what he meant. He shook his head like he was ashamed of his own thought. He said, "Maybe I am too long from home." He left before sundown. I did not see him again for years, but his words stuck to me like burrs. That was the first time I had heard anyone put language to what I had been feeling. The war ended on paper, but its ghost remained. Emancipation came down the road like a slow wagon you could hear long before it appeared. Federal officers arrived to read proclamations on courthouse steps. Enslaved people gathered in churchyards, in fields, in the dirt road outside Riverlark, listening to words that sounded like rain after drought. Some cried, some did not believe it. Some stared at Hawthorne, face trying to read what he would do next. Hawthorne signed papers grudgingly. He kept his land, his house, much of his wealth. He lost his workforce, and what he lost in cash he tried to gain back in control. He offered wages low as insult to the people who had been his slaves, and many took it because hunger does not vanish when chains do. But others left, walking toward Beaufort or Charleston or wherever a rumor of work lived. Hannah left too. I watched her one morning crossing the churchyard with a satchel, thin from years of grief, hair threaded with gray. She did not look toward Riverlark. She did not look toward me. Yet when she passed the old oak by the gate, she stopped, turned her head just once and said, "Reverend, you remember my baby." It was not a question. It was a sentence you tattoo into someone else's soul. I opened my mouth to say I had tried, that I had believed I was protecting Mercy, that I was sorry. Hannah did not wait. She walked on. Mercy watched the emancipation, like a person seeing the sea for the first time. She stood on the gallery while the freed people gathered on the lawn to hear Hawthorne announce wages and work terms. She did not stay upstairs as Priscilla had ordered. She stood where they could all see her. The old enslaved men looked up and blinked, uncertain. The women stiffened. A little boy in patched trousers waved at her, and she waved back before Priscilla yanked her inside. That night, Mercy came to church alone. I was in the sanctuary lighting candles for evening prayer. She sat in the front pew and waited until I turned. She said, "Reverend, are we all equal before God?" I said yes. She said, "Then why do I feel like a thief in my own skin?" I felt the air go cold. I asked what she meant. She said, "I hear them whisper my name down there. I hear other names too. Sometimes I wake up with a song in my head I do not remember learning." She pressed a hand to her chest like she was trying to hold something in place. She said, "Priscilla says I am Mercy Eleanor Langford. But when I look in the mirror, I see a girl who does not belong to that name." I wanted to tell her everything. The locket, Eleanor confession, Hannah grief, the baptism lie, my own complicity. But the church is a cage as much as a shelter, and I had built part of the bars. Outside the door, I heard hoofbeats, Hawthorne carriage. If he found Mercy here at night without consent, there would be consequences for her and for me. So I said the coward truth. I said, "Names can be gifts or burdens. You will know which yours is when you are old enough to choose it." She stared at me a long time. Then she nodded like she had learned what she needed to learn. She said, "I think somebody already chose mine." She left before Hawthorne stepped inside. The next day, Priscilla came to the rectory furious. She said Mercy had been restless, asking after the quarters, asking after her mother, asking after emancipation papers. She said I needed to speak to Mercy about humility and gratitude. I said, "She is not a child anymore." Priscilla smiled thin. She said, "She will always be what we made her." Then she leaned closer and said, "Reverend, there are things about that girl you do not know." I felt my spine tighten. I said, "What things?" Priscilla stood very still and said, "Eleanor was sentimental. She thought she was saving a poor wretch. But there is a reason Hawthorne never spoke that girl's mother name. There is a reason. We keep her inside. She is a spark from a fire that nearly burned this family down." I asked, "What fire?" Priscilla said, "The kind you should not go digging for unless you enjoy getting your hands black." She left without another word. That afternoon, I went to Riverlark under the pretense of bringing a book of prayers to Hawthorne. I intended to ask him directly. I found him in the garden among dead rose bushes. He had not shaved. His eyes were hollow. He said, "Reverend, I have lost everything except that girl." The way he said it chilled me, as if he was speaking of a thing. I asked about Mercy Mother. His jaw clenched. He said, "Some matters are between a man and God." I said, "Eleanor told me the girl was found after a storm." He snapped his head toward me. He said, "She told you that?" I hesitated, realizing too late that I had revealed a portion of Eleanor's secret. Hawthorne, face twisted, not with grief now but with anger and fear. He grabbed my sleeve. He said, "Did she tell you anything else?" I said no. He stared at me as if trying to measure whether I was lying. Then he let go and smoothed his coat as though he had done nothing. He said, "The child is mine. That is all you need to know." I asked why the secrecy, now that slavery was gone. He said, "Because even free men can be cruel, and this county would tear her apart if they knew what blood runs in her veins." I asked what blood. He looked past me at the river and said, "Bad blood." That night I went home and opened the church register from Eleanor death year. I read and reread Mercy baptism line. It looked thin on the page suddenly, like a thread that could be pulled to unravel everything. I did something I had not done since I took my vows. I went into the vestry and pulled out the old lockbox where we kept personal relics from private confessions. I had placed Eleanor Locket there on the day she died, telling myself it was safer hidden. I opened it now. The curl of black hair was still inside like a sleeping insect. I held it under candlelight. I thought of Mercy Hare, being shorn the day she entered the house. I thought of her blue eyes. I thought of Priscilla, words about fire. I felt dread settle on me like wet cloth. A week later, a freedman named Josiah came to me after evening prayer. Josiah had worked riverlark rice canals since boyhood. He was careful in speech, eyes always scanning for danger, even after freedom. He said, "Reverend, I need to talk to you about Miss Mercy." I said, "Speak." He looked toward the door, as if expecting someone to step through. He said, "Folks down there say she been seeing things." I asked what things. He said, "At night she wander close to the quarters. No lantern, just walking like she listening." He said some of the old women seen her standing by the river, talking to somebody that ain't there. When they call out, she freezes like a deer, then goes back to the house. He said, she asked about a woman named Hannah. She asked about a girl who died in the swamp years ago. My mouth went dry. I asked why they had not told me sooner. Josiah shrugged. He said, "When the church belongs to the house, who you think it listened to?" He turned to leave, then said, "Reverend, some secrets rot the ground. If you don't dig them up, they grow teeth." After he left, I sat a long time in the empty church listening to the night insects batter at the screened windows. I knew Mercy was searching for herself without knowing the map, and that every step she took toward the truth took her deeper into whatever Priscilla had buried. I went to Riverlark the next morning to speak with Mercy alone. I found her in the old portrait room where Eleanor paintings hung. She was standing before the largest one now, the marriage portrait, wearing a gray dress Priscilla favored for her. Her hair had grown long again and was pinned in a style that mimicked Eleanor's own. From behind, if the light was right, she could have been Eleanor Ghost. Mercy did not turn when I entered. She said, "Reverend, do you believe the dead can call the living?" I said, "I believe the living call the dead all the time, and sometimes the echo feels like an answer." She finally turned. Her face was calm, but her eyes were raw. She said, "I think she is calling me." I asked who. She said, "The woman in that painting. She says, 'Come home.'" I said, "This is your home." Mercy smiled without humor. She said, "Then why do I feel like I am still outside the door?" I did not answer fast enough. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. She said, "I know I was born in the quarters. Priscilla thinks I don't remember, but I do. Not clear, like a dream you carry in your bones. Mud on my feet, a cabin door, a voice singing low. I said, 'Mercy.' She said, 'I found a name in the attic, sewn into a quilt, Hannah.' I asked where she was now. I said she left after freedom. Mercy nodded as if that confirmed something. She said, 'Priscilla told me my ma died when I was small, but I saw her once in town a year ago. She was buying cloth. She looked right through me like she was trying not to drown.' I felt the lie I had helped carve into her spine crack. I said, 'What else have you found?' Mercy hesitated. She said, 'There is a room in the east wing locked with a key Priscilla wears. I went in once when she was asleep. There were baby clothes there, many, some with bloodstains. There were little shoes lined up like a row of teeth. There was a ledger with names crossed out.' I asked what names. Mercy shook her head. She said, 'I could not read the handwriting, but I saw my name in it, again and again, next to dates.' I flinched at the word dates and quickly looked around as if the house might have ears. Mercy continued, voice steady as if she had decided fear could no longer own her. She said, 'Reverend, I think I was not the first.' I said, 'The first what?' She stared at me. She said, 'The first girl they brought up here to be her.' I felt my knees go weak. I said, 'Mercy, you should not go into that wing alone.' She said, 'I won't be alone next time.' Then she asked me for something that turned my blood to ice. She said, 'Could you look in your church book and tell me who my mother was baptized as?' I opened my mouth and closed it. I could not say no without confirming the truth. I could not say yes without betraying the people who controlled her life. In that moment, I saw clearly what I had become, not a shepherd, but a gatekeeper for a plantation family crime. I said softly, 'I will see what I can find.' Mercy nodded, and for the first time, I saw something like hope. But it was a desperate hope. the way a drowning person hopes for a branch. Before I could ask more, Priscilla entered. She looked from Mercy to me and knew instantly that the walls had shifted. She smiled polite and said, "Reverend, you honor us with your care. Mercy, go to your lesson." Mercy left without a word. Priscilla waited until the door closed. Then she said, "You are filling her head with questions." I said, "She is filling her own head." Priscilla stepped closer. Her eyes were flat. She said, "That girl is a project your church helped sanctify. Do not forget that." I said, "What project?" She tilted her head like she was amused at my innocence. She said, "Eleanor could not bear children, but she could bear ideas. She thought a girl with her face would keep Hawthorne from breaking." She did not ask whether the girl wanted that burden. She did not ask whether the girl would survive it. I asked her about the locked room, the baby clothes, the crossed names. Her smile did not move. She said, "The war years were hard. Women miscarry. Children die. That is all." I said, "Mercy thinks there were others before her." Priscilla, face finally changed, not to fear but to irritation, like a tool that has begun to rust. She said, "Mercy thinks many things. She has a vivid mind. That is why she will be useful." I said, "Useful to what end?" Priscilla leaned close enough that I smelled cloves on her breath. She said, "To keep this house alive." She straightened and smoothed her skirt. She said, "Hawthorne is failing. When he dies, a young mistress with proper papers keeps Riverlark in Langford hands. That is the end," I said, "and if she refuses." Priscilla laughed softly. She said, "Refusal is a luxury slaves and women never have, Reverend." Then she walked me to the door as if our talk had been about weather. I returned to St. Dymphna with my stomach knotted and my mind racing through every baptism and burial I had let Priscilla place in the books. That night I did what I should have done years before. I spread the parish registers across my desk and compared ink, handwriting, gaps, and substitutions. I saw it at last, the pattern hiding in plain sight. In the decades before Mercy baptism, there were other entries made in the same swift slanted hand. Girls recorded as wards, baptized quickly, then later a burial note with no clear cause, sometimes with no name at all, just infant female or young ward of Riverlark. There were too many for the usual, fevers, too many to be chance. I felt a cold certainty settle on me. Mercy was not the first. She was the one who had lasted. The next morning I rode to town to find Hannah. I asked discreetly among freed folk who had moved into the outskirts. By dusk I found a small cabin near the waterline. Hannah opened the door before I knocked as if she had known I was coming. She looked older than her years. Her eyes were dry now, not because grief had left, but because it had burned through all the tears long ago. I said, "Hannah, I need to ask about Mercy Birth." She stared at me. She said, "You mean the girl you baptized into a lie?" I swallowed. I said yes. Hannah laughed once, sharp. She said, "You want the truth now because the house starting to crack." She stepped aside and let me in. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and salt. On the wall hung a small scrap of cloth, embroidered with a name. Mercy. Hannah saw me looking and said, "I made that when she was born, before they took her." I asked who Mercy father was. Hannah looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Her father was Hawthorne and not Hawthorne." I did not understand. She said, "There are two men in a house sometimes, the one you see and the one you don't." She took a breath and began to tell me a story I wish I had never heard. Years before Mercy Birth, when Eleanor health began failing, Priscilla had come to Riverlark to help. Hawthorne had a brother named Nathaniel who had lived away in Savannah. A gambler, a drunk, a man with a temper like dry straw. When the war rumors began, Nathaniel returned to Riverlark under the excuse of family duty. He moved into the East Wing. He began taking enslaved women at night, not with affection, not even with the coldness of routine, but with something hunger mad in him. Hannah said he came to her cabin once and dragged her out while her husband was in the fields. She said she fought until he put a knife to her throat. She said Eleanor found bruises on her neck the next day and asked gentle questions she was too afraid to answer. Hannah said Priscilla knew what Nathaniel was doing and did nothing. More than that, she covered it, sending women out of the main quarters into hidden shacks by the swamp so nobody in town would see their swelling bellies. Hannah said there were children born in those shacks, pale enough to look white in candlelight, blue-eyed babies that Priscilla took away at birth. Some were sold to distant kin as orphans. Some were buried in the family cemetery, with no marker. The women were told the babies had died. Hannah said she knew some had not because she heard their cries fade down the hall as Priscilla carried them to the locked room in the east wing. She paused then, hands clenched in her lap. She said, "When Eleanor got too sick to walk, Priscilla changed the plan. She started bringing one girl at a time into the big house, training them to be Eleanor Comfort, to be her shadow, to be the daughter she could not have. The first one was a girl named Cora, light skin, soft voice. Priscilla dressed her in Eleanor old clothes. She made her sit by Eleanor bed and read aloud. But Cora got scared and ran back toward the quarters one night. Nathaniel caught her by the river and beat her so badly she could not stand. She died 2 days later, buried as young Ward in your book. The next was Eliza, then May, then Clara. Each one lasted a season, maybe a year, then was gone. Some got sick, some vanished. One was found in the swamp, throat filled with mud. Priscilla wrote it all down. She kept the ledger to track which girls might fit, which ones had the Langford look. Hannah leaned forward and said, "Mercy was different because she was Eleanor Choice, not Priscilla. Eleanor found her after that storm, yes, but she found her because she had already been watching the quarters for a girl with her eyes. She found Mercy in my arms. She said, 'Hannah, I would like to take this child into the house to educate her.' I knew what that meant. I told her no, but she touched my hand and said, 'I will keep her safe from my husband's brother.' That was the first time anyone had spoken that evil aloud to me. I believed her. I let her take Mercy. I thought she was saving my girl." Hannah's voice broke then. She said, "Maybe she was. Maybe she was just saving herself." I sat, numb. The pieces clicked into place with a sound like bone. Nathaniel. The locked room. The baby clothes. The ledger. The other girls. Eleanor desperation. Priscilla machinery. Hawthorne shame. The church ink sealing it all into holy lie. I asked if Nathaniel was still alive. Hannah shook her head. She said he died during the war, shot in a tavern fight. Body shipped home in a box, buried quick. Priscilla cried loud at the funeral, then went back to running the house like nothing had happened. Hannah looked at me and said, "Reverend, you gonna tell Mercy the truth?" I opened my mouth and no words came. Hannah said, "You already told her what she needed to know when you baptized her. That her mouth don't matter if white folk want her quiet." She stood and opened the door. She said, "If you got any soul left, go free that girl from their story." I left with night falling and the river black as spilled ink. When I returned to my rectory, I found a note slipped under the door in Priscilla's hand. It said, "Reverend, I hear you have been visiting old friends. Be careful the mud does not swallow you." I stared at that line a long time. She was watching me. She always had been. The next day I went to Riverlark to speak with Mercy before Priscilla could tighten the net. I found the house in chaos. Hawthorne had suffered a stroke at breakfast. Half his face drooped. His speech was thick. The doctor from town shook his head and said he might live. He might not, but the man you knew is already half gone. Priscilla moved through the hall issuing orders like a general. She saw me and snapped, "Mercy is upstairs, do not disturb her." I did anyway. Mercy was in the nursery. sitting on the floor, among Eleanor's old dolls. She looked smaller than she had yesterday, like fear had hollowed her out. She said, "Reverend, I heard them say he might die." I said yes. She swallowed and said, "Then Priscilla will make me sign something." I asked what. She said, "Papers. She says I will be mistress now. She says I must marry a suitable man to keep the estate in family hands. She says I must never speak of the quarters again." I said, "Mercy, you don't have to do what she says." Mercy laughed softly. She said, "I never had to do what she says, and yet here I am." I sat beside her on the floor because no chair felt right. I took the locket from my pocket. I had carried it since Hannah's story, like a hot coal. I said, "Eleanor gave me this before she died." Mercy opened it. She touched the curl of hair. Her eyes widened. She whispered, "That looks like mine." I said, "It is. She chose you. She loved you in her way." Mercy stared at the locket, then said, "Was she my mother?" I took a breath. There is no gentle way to hand someone the truth when the truth has teeth. I said, "Your mother is alive. Her name is Hannah. She is free. She loved you enough to survive losing you." Mercy. Grip tightened on the locket. Her face went blank. Then tears came fast, not sobbing. More like the river after a dam breaks. She said, "Why did you let them take me?" I had no defense. I said, "I believed I was protecting you." Mercy shook her head. She said, "You were protecting the house." She wiped her face with the heel of her hand and said, "Who was my father?" I hesitated. Mercy looked at me so hard I felt flayed. I said, "Hawthorne is your father by blood, but there is more." I told her about Nathaniel, about the women in the swamp shacks, about the other girls, about Priscilla Ledger. Mercy did not react the way I expected. She did not scream or faint. She just grew very still. After a long silence, she said, "So they have been doing this a long time." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you wrote my name into it." I said, "Yes." She took another breath and said, "Reverend, do you know what it feels like to be built out of other people's grief?" I said, "No." She said, "It feels like wearing a dress stitched out of funeral cloth. It fits, but it smells of someone else." I could not speak. Mercy stood. Her voice was calmer than I had ever heard it. She said, "I am going to that locked room tonight." I said, "Mercy, don't." She said, "I am going. I need to see the ledger. I need to see who I am standing on." I said, "Priscilla will stop you." Mercy said, "Then you will help me." She said it like a command, not a request. I opened my mouth to refuse, but in the space behind my ribs, something finally broke free of fear. I nodded. The plan was simple and ridiculous, the kind you make when you are out of time. That night, Priscilla kept vigil by Hawthorne bed. The doctor gave laudanum to quiet the house. The servants moved soft. I came to Riverlark after midnight under the excuse of prayer. Priscilla let me in with a look. That meant she did not believe me, but did not want to waste energy accusing me. She said, "Pray in the parlor." I said I would. She went back upstairs. Mercy waited behind the kitchen door, where the old passage to the east wing began. She wore a dark cloak and carried a candle stub. Her hands shook once, then steadied. We moved through the servant corridor that ran behind the walls, a narrow throat of wood and dust. I had walked it many times in my youth to bring communion to sick house staff, but never with the sense that it was leading us into a grave. The east wing was colder than the rest of the house. It had always been kept for guests, for Nathaniel, for storage. Now it felt abandoned in a way that was not empty but watchful. The locked door stood at the end of a hallway lined with portraits of Langford men who all wore the same proud dead eyes. Mercy stopped in front of the door. She whispered, "I have never stood this close." I pulled a small iron key from my pocket. I had taken it earlier from Priscilla's work basket in the sick room. My hands sweating so much I feared it would slip. Mercy looked at me, and I saw not gratitude but something closer to pity. She said, "You should have done this." "Long ago." I said nothing. The key turned with a soft click that sounded loud enough to wake the dead. The door swung inward. The smell hit us first. Stale linen, old milk, sweet rot. The room was small, windowless, lit only by our candle. Along one wall, shelves held folded baby clothes, some yellowed, some newer, all arranged by size. Tiny caps, booties, ribbons. On the other wall were cribs, 3 of them, empty now, their rails scratched by something that had been small and desperate. A rocking chair sat in the corner with a dark stain on the seat. Mercy covered her mouth. She stepped toward a trunk at the foot of the bed. I opened it. Inside lay quilts, each with a name stitched into a corner. Cora, Eliza, May, Clara. Names I had read in my own register without understanding. At the bottom was a quilt with Mercy's name. Mercy lifted it like it might bite her. Her shoulders released a shaky breath. She said, "I was laid here." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not like a child, like an object waiting to be assigned." She moved to the desk against the far wall. A ledger lay there, thick, cracked leather, pages swollen from damp. She opened it. Candlelight shook over lines of names and notes in Priscilla's sharp hand. Suitable, defiant, eyes too dark, sickly, removed, buried. Mercy read until her lips went pale. She stopped at a page and held it out to me. It listed Hannah's name beside Mercy birth, then a line that made my stomach twist. Chosen by Mistress. Below it, in a different ink, conditioned for replacement. Mercy whispered, "Replacement." She turned another page and found a list of infant births with no mothers recorded. Only initials and a mark that meant sale. She said, "These were babies from the swamp shacks." I nodded. She said, "They are my brothers and sisters, some sold, some dead." She pressed the ledger to her chest and made a sound I can only describe as a laugh with no air in it. She said, "They built me on a pile of bones and called it love." Behind us, a floorboard creaked. We froze. Priscilla's voice drifted from the hall, soft and close. Mercy blew the candle out instinctively. Darkness swallowed us. I heard Priscilla's skirt brush the wall. She paused at the open door. She said, "Mercy." My blood went to ice. Mercy did not answer. Priscilla stepped inside. The faint light from the hallway framed her silhouette. She held a lamp, the flame low. She looked around the room like a woman who had found a thief in her pantry. She said, "I knew you would come here sooner or later." Mercy stepped out of the shadows with the ledger in her hands. Her voice was steady. She said, "How many?" Priscilla did not pretend not to understand. She said, "Enough to learn what works." Mercy said, "You killed them." Priscilla sighed as if explaining a household budget. She said, "Some died, some were sent away, some were unfit for the role." Mercy said, "That role, to be her." Priscilla lifted her chin. She said, "To be what this house needs." Mercy said, "A ghost." Priscilla's smile was thin. She said, "A lady." Mercy held up the quilt with her name. She said, "You wrote me down like meat." Priscilla looked at the quilt with mild disdain. She said, "You were lucky. Eleanor Attention gave you a chance. Without it, freedom would have dumped you in the road with nothing but hunger." Mercy said, "I would rather have hunger than this." Priscilla stepped closer. Her voice sharpened. She said, "You think you can walk away now. You think the county will welcome you if you show your true blood. You are a Langford on paper. That paper is all that keeps you from being dragged back into the mud you came from." Mercy said, "The mud is where my mother lives." Priscilla's eyes flashed. She said, "Your mother is a field woman who would sell you for a penny if she could." Mercy said, "You are lying." Priscilla said, "I am telling you the truth of the world." She moved toward Mercy as if to take the ledger. Mercy backed up. Priscilla said, "Give me that book." Mercy said, "No." Priscilla said, Then I will take it. She reached. Mercy pulled the ledger to her chest. Priscilla struck her, hard this time, open-handed across the face. Mercy staggered, not from pain alone, but from the fact that Priscilla had finally shown what she truly was beneath all the manners. Priscilla hissed, "You will obey." Mercy wiped the blood from her lip and looked at Priscilla with a calm that frightened me more than any scream would have. She said, "I won't." Priscilla drew a small pistol from her pocket. I had not known she carried one. She pointed it at Mercy's chest. She said, "Do you know how easy it would be to write you out like the others? Another fever, another accident, another burial entry in your neat little book." Mercy did not flinch. She said, "You already buried me alive. Go ahead and finish it." Priscilla's hand shook a fraction. I saw something in her eyes then, not fear of Mercy, but fear of losing control of the story she had spent her life writing. She said, "If you die now, Riverlark dies with you. Hawthorne needs an heir. The law needs a lady. The church needs a name to keep its respect. You are that name." Mercy said, "I am not your name." She stepped closer to Priscilla Barrel. She said, "Shoot me if you want, but you will have to explain why a ward of Riverlark was found dead in the locked room you have kept secret for years." Priscilla's jaw worked. The pistol lowered a hair. Mercy said, "You are not as untouchable as you think. The war proved that. Freedom proved that. I am leaving this house tonight." Priscilla laughed bitter. She said, "Where will you go?" Mercy said, "To Hannah, to Josiah people, to anyone who knows my real face." Priscilla said, "They will hate you. You wore silk while they wore chains." Mercy said, "They might, but at least it will be my life." Priscilla lifted the pistol again. I stepped forward without thinking. I said, "Priscilla, stop." She turned it toward me. Her eyes were cold. She said, "Reverend, you have no authority here." I said, "You are threatening a baptized member of my flock." She smiled. She said, "Your flock belongs to whoever holds the deed." I felt the old cowardice surge, then something else, a kind of rage that surprised me. I said, "I know about the other girls. I know about the babies. I know you used the church to cover it. If you harm her now, I will open every register to the federal office in Beaufort. I will speak from the pulpit if I have to. I will tell them about Nathaniel." Priscilla stared at me. For a moment, I thought she might shoot us both. Then she did something worse. She smiled kindly, as if I were a child who had wandered into grown matters. She said, "Reverend, you will do nothing, because if you open your mouth, you open your own sins with it. You wrote her name. You sanctified her replacement. You buried the others without asking a question. Your hands are in this blood as deep as mine." I went cold because she was right. Mercy looked at me then, and I saw the betrayal in her eyes cut deeper than Priscilla's slap. I whispered, "Mercy, I am sorry." She did not answer. Priscilla said, "Now give me the ledger." Mercy lifted it. Then, without warning, she moved to the lamp Priscilla held and thrust the ledger into the flame. The leather caught fast, pages curling like dead leaves. Priscilla screamed and lunged, but Mercy kicked the lamp over. Oil splashed. Fire ran across the floorboards like a living thing. In seconds, the room was lit by a hungry orange that turned the baby clothes into shadows dancing on the walls. Priscilla shrieked, "What have you done?" Mercy said, "I have ended your story." Smoke filled the air. I grabbed Mercy's arm. We ran into the hall as flames licked up the door frame. Priscilla followed, coughing, still clutching the pistol. She fired once down the corridor. The shot cracked wood and sent splinters flying. We turned into the servant passage. Behind us, the east wing roared. The fire spread faster than I would have believed, fed by old dry timber and hidden oil stores from war days. Bells began ringing downstairs. Servants screamed. Someone pounded on Hawthorne's bedroom door. Mercy and I burst out into the kitchen, where black housewomen were already hauling buckets. Mercy shouted, "Get him out!" and pointed upstairs. They did not ask who she meant. They knew. In the chaos, nobody saw Mercy slip out the back door with me into the night. We ran across the lawn toward the river road. Behind us, Riverlark burned with a sound like an animal dying. The sky glowed red. Freed people in cabins along the road came out and stared. Some ran to help, some just watched, faces lit by fire like old memories. Mercy did not look back. When we reached the riverside path, she slowed, panting, and said, "I did not mean to burn the whole house." I said, "Sometimes a lie is a house, and once you set it alight, it burns everything it has touched." She nodded as if she understood. We made it to Hannah's cabin before dawn. Hannah opened the door with a knife in her hand. When she saw Mercy, she froze. Mercy stepped inside. She said softly, "Ma." The knife dropped into the dirt. Hannah reached out like she did not trust that her arms were real. Then she pulled Mercy into her chest and let out a sound I will never forget. A sound like a woman being stitched back together. Mercy cried then. Not quiet tears, but full-body sobs she had been holding since the riverbank. I stood outside while mother and daughter clung to each other in the dim cabin light. When Mercy finally lifted her head, she looked at me through the doorway. Her eyes were swollen and raw, but there was something new in them, something like a person waking up after a long fever. She said, "Reverend, go back. Tell them whatever you want. I am done hiding." I rode back to town as smoke drifted over the marsh. Riverlark East Wing was a charcoal skeleton by breakfast. Hawthorne had been carried out alive, but barely. Priscilla was found on the lawn in her nightdress, hair singed, screaming that thieves had set the fire. She blamed Union raiders, though there were none. She blamed freedmen. She blamed the devil. She did not speak Mercy name once. I said nothing then. I watched the county gather like flies around the ruin. They mourned the tragedy of a noble house lost. They did not mourn the tiny bones that had been hidden in its walls. Hawthorne died 2 days later. The doctor said it was the stroke, but I saw the way his eyes searched the burned wing from his bed, like a man waiting for the past to come and claim him. Priscilla took charge of the estate immediately, waving papers that said Mercy was heir and had vanished during the fire, likely abducted or dead. The county accepted this because a woman with money can make any story respectable if she tells it in a calm voice. She came to church in black and sat in the front pew I once let Mercy sit in. She cried properly. She accepted condolences properly. She asked me to lead a special service for poor lost Mercy's soul. I looked at her across the aisle and felt a cold revulsion that was also fear. I said I would. That night I wrote a letter to the federal office in Beaufort, with every detail Hannah had given me, every gap in the registers, every false burial, every ward name that had ended in silence. I signed it with my own name. I did not spare myself. If the truth was going to surface, it had to take me with it. I sent the letter by a trusted freed rider at dawn. In the weeks that followed, investigators came. Not many, but enough. They questioned Priscilla. They searched the burned wing and found beneath the ash a pit of tiny bones. They found quilts with stitched names half burned. They found a second ledger hidden in a metal cash box under Priscilla floorboards, a copy she must have made out of habit. They found my church register entries and compared ink. They asked me why I had baptized these girls as wards without lineage. I told them the truth. I watched the county turn on me with the slow disgust people reserve for a mirror that shows them their own face. Priscilla was arrested, but not with the drama you might hope for. She was treated gently, like a woman who had become confused by grief. She was held in a parlor in town, given tea, given visitors. When the case went before a judge, most of the county men said there was no proof she had intended harm, that girls of mixed blood were prone to sickness and wandering, that the war years were chaotic, that the church had already cleansed their souls. The federal men pressed. The bones pressed. My testimony pressed. In the end, she was not convicted of murder. She was convicted of fraud, concealment, disturbing the peace, crimes that sounded small enough for the county to swallow. She was sentenced to a term in a state facility far away. She left town in a carriage with curtains drawn. On the day she went, she turned once and met my eyes. She smiled as if to say, "You still belong to my story." But her smile was weaker now because stories lose power when their ink burns. Mercy did not return to Riverlark. She stayed with Hannah for a season, learning the rhythms of a life she had been kept from. She helped at a freed school in Beaufort, teaching letters to children who had never held a book without fear. She took down her hair and braided it her own way. She began to wear colors, not chosen by Priscilla. I visited once, cautious, ashamed. Mercy met me on the porch. She said, "I don't hate you, Reverend." I said, "You should." She said, "I hate what you did, but I see what you're trying to do now." I asked what she would do next. She said, "I will choose a name that fits my bones." I asked if she would keep Mercy. She looked toward the river. She said, "Mercy was her wish. Maybe I will keep it as a scar, not as a cage." She smiled then, and it was not Eleanor's smile, not Priscilla-crafted smile, but something rough and real like sunlight through pine branches. She said, "My mother calls me Lark. She said I sounded like a bird when I was born. Maybe I am Lark now. I wanted to say something about God and new beginnings." She stopped me with a raised hand. She said, "If you want to make things right, tell this story. Say their names, all of them. Don't let the church bury them again." So I am telling it now because a church that stays silent in the face of evil becomes its altar. Because replacement is just another word for erasure. Because there were girls before Mercy who never got to burn the ledger. Cora, who died by the river. Eliza, who vanished in winter. May, who coughed her lungs out in a locked room while a lady listened through the wall. Clara, who was found in the swamp with mud in her mouth. Babies who were carried away in baskets before their mothers could count their fingers. And because there are still churches, even now, that think respectability is more holy than truth. St. Dymphna survived the scandal, though it shrank. Some planters left for other parishes. Some freed families stayed because they said a church is not a building, but the people who refused to let it rot. I remained rector, older now, less certain of my own goodness. Every time I pass the register shelf, I feel the weight of the ink I once wrote. I keep Eleanor Lockett in my desk, not as a relic of her love, but as a reminder that love without honesty can still be a weapon. Riverlark land was divided after the fire. Freed families bought parcels with pooled wages. The big house was never rebuilt. The East Wing Foundation remains as blackened brick that vines crawl over like fingers. People say on humid nights you can hear a rocking chair creak in the ruins. I have never heard it. But I have heard something else when the river wind is right. I have heard a young woman laugh on the road to Beaufort, a laugh free of practice, and I have heard children answering her in a choir of new names. That is not a ghost story. That is a survivor story. Yet the horror remains because if one Priscilla could do this under a cross, another can too. Anywhere there are people willing to sign lies into holy books. That is why I tell you this now, in as much detail as my trembling hands can manage, because the dead do call to the living, and sometimes they do it through a story that refuses to stay buried.